Thinking about building vocabulary or building what we talk about or how we define boundaries, this is not an exhaustive list, so this is just my offering to you. So, boundaries can be the following. They can be guidelines for maintaining positive and supportive relationships with clients or with colleagues. They can be rules and limits a person creates for themselves, which you all have started to talk about already. They can be a clear understanding of the limits and responsibilities of your role as in this case, service provider from my sphere, but in whatever roles you all have. But they are defined, especially in a professional space, by the role or maybe even by a job description, right? So that's a way to think about how to define your role and start to define boundaries at work. And they are the space between a provider's work and personal life, between personal and professional, sort of the discussion that we just had about the differences between professional selves or professional relationships and relationships in the personal sphere. More definitions of boundaries, and this one is very much connected to our discussion today, which is, again, boundaries before burning out, boundaries before burnout. So boundaries can be defined as self-identified professional practices used to guide fulfillment, growth, prevent burnout, and improve productivity. They are also, again, depending on the spheres that you all inhabit, I will say, as a school psychologist myself, as a person that dives into clinical spaces, there are a set of ethical behaviors that I have to follow in order to continue my licensing or continue my certification, right? And so there are, depending on your role, a set of ethical behaviors set forth by licensing boards and employers that protect the integrity and welfare of both the client and the employee so that therapeutic, in this case, work can partake. Often called ethical principles or codes of ethics, depending on the field. Boundaries can also be a line that marks the limits of an area. So this is a very sort of, I want to say sort of tangible definition of what a boundary is. So it can be defined as a dividing line. For example, if we're talking about geography or physical spaces, the eastern boundary of the wilderness, right? Or the boundary between one geographic space and another, right? Or they can be, again, borders, frontiers, a borderline, or a partition. So that is some of the ways that you can define boundaries. Now, if we think about, again, this idea of the workspace or the professional space, there are boundaries that we establish ourselves, and then there are the boundaries that are established for us. So I'm actually going to start backwards. If we're looking at professional boundaries that have been given to us, what I mean to say is, again, whatever the role dictates, or whatever sort of ethical guidelines you might have, depending on the role that you have or the organization in which you work, those things are set for you. Those are not things that you are deciding for yourselves. Does that make sense? And so I will say, again, using a clinical sphere as the example, psychologists, clinicians have ethical guidelines that talk about how much self-disclosure is appropriate. So when I talk about self-disclosure, then it means, what am I saying about myself in order to connect to my client, in order to have a therapeutic conversation? I recognize that not everybody in this room has those kinds of limitations. However, it does not mean that you don't have job descriptions or roles that tell you this is appropriate with the client and this is not appropriate with the client. So again, these things are given to you. When we're talking about self-identified established boundaries at work, it might be, and I found myself thinking about this when I was preparing to talk to you tonight. For example, the ability to work only 40 hours a week or only 50 hours a week, whatever that number is for you all. I recognize that that number fluctuates across fields, across roles. And what I'm inviting you to think about, though, is that there are sort of the established expectations, and maybe there's also a level of the expectation that isn't named, but that's something that you learn over time that, well, maybe actually 40 hours is not enough. It's actually 50 hours, but the job description says X. I recognize that that is different. It actually made me think about a time where I provided a sort of taking care of yourselves at work training with a consulting firm that specifically asked me not to say anything about how much time people spend at work. They knew that I was potentially going to come in and say, I think you should consider how much time you're actually spending at work and what the expectation is. And because of the type of organization that they were and how the culture of that organization, they did not want me to set a number limit because that's how they worked, right? And so I say that to you all again as an example of sort of the explicit guidelines and then maybe the not so explicit expectations, which have to do with the culture of an organization. And then we can add, again, the factors that sort of stipulate, well, what do I feel that I can actually provide, or in which I can actually be productive? What does that mean for me? And again, I recognize that we don't always have the freedom to set those boundaries given the organizations in which we might work. What makes talking about boundaries important? Why are we talking about this? Why spend time discussing this together, right? So here's one quote that helps us think about this. Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. Another way of saying that is boundaries are what I need to be able to articulate or know about myself, and to know about you as well, in order for us to engage in relationship. Now, I know that this says love, but I think what I want to invite you to think about, though, is what is it that you need in order to be your best connector self, what have you, in relationship anywhere, whether it's at work or whether it's in your personal space. What might make holding boundaries difficult, right? And so Brene started to talk a little bit about this, but let's just break it down. So here's a list of potential reasons why holding boundaries might be difficult, both setting and holding them. We want to connect and help other people. We might have limited resources with excessive workloads, to switch that word up. There might be collective exhaustion or burnout. So wherever you're working, the team itself might be collectively exhausted and burnt out. And so everyone needs help, and it's hard to say no when everyone is in need. Setting boundaries can be exhausting in and of itself, because there might be situations in which you're setting those boundaries over and over again. And that repetition can be exhausting. We have our own emotional needs, history, triggers, what have you, which we're going to talk a little bit more when we get to the awareness part of this discussion. Clients are trying to get their needs met. So depending on the work that we do, again, clients or colleagues are also trying to get their own needs met in the best ways that they know how. And so that is sort of a conflict that's happening. Everyone is just trying to get their needs met, in essence. We don't necessarily trust other people to do the jobs that we think we might need to or want to do. So again, I think that this also speaks to the culture within an organization that we might be working in, and that there might be situations where we've been given a lot of work and that makes us feel successful. We're getting positive feedback, what have you. And then sometimes what ends up happening, which I've also seen in workplaces, is that the people that do a really good job then get bombarded with all the work. And so then you find yourselves in situations where it's hard to say no, because it feels as though giving that project or saying you lead this or we trust you with X feels like a compliment, because on the one hand it is, and yet it's still potentially going to cause burnout, because then you're holding everything, right? So then the people that are the most competent then are getting the most work, in essence. And then we use the same services as our clients or live in the same neighborhood. So this is really, again, sort of a boundary in terms of something that you said before, Gunn, at the beginning, which was when you find yourselves in situations where you have to sort of set that boundary, or like, what am I showing about myself or my life? When you all are living and working in similar spaces, holding that boundary or that space of, I don't want you to see all of what my life looks like necessarily, for whatever that reason is. And sometimes that's hard to keep, right? So if, let's say that we were all living and working in New York City in a particular neighborhood, and our clients or colleagues or what have you are all in the same space, holding that boundary might be difficult because of that. What can happen if we don't have good boundaries? So what's the result of not having or setting good boundaries? Now, I recognize some of this might not fit, again, because this is a little bit more clinical in nature. However, I still think it's important to go through. So in a human services space, if people have poor boundaries, this is what potentially can happen. For clients, there might be inappropriate relationships and expectations. There might be exploitation. This is actually in some ways connected to the power differential that we talked about before. And so if there are not boundaries set, then power differentials can lead to exploitation on both sides of clients or staff relationships. Anxiety might be caused because rules are not clear. Again, I would say the same thing for staff. Feelings of confusion, betrayal, or abandonment. Again, and in some ways, even in the roles that you find yourselves in, if there are unclear expectations for clients, then when they believe something to be true and that is not the case, then they're going to feel a particular way about that. So they might feel confused, betrayed, what have you. For staff, again, team splitting, which is really, and actually you all kind of said this a little bit, if boundaries are not clear and expectations are not followed across the board with everyone, if I use the example that you were giving, Glenn, before about a leave or what have you, then one rule applies to one person, but it doesn't apply to someone else, that's a blurry boundary, and that leads to confusion. And again, this idea that there's even potentially favoritism existing in the workplace, and that's not okay. There might be potential for unethical behaviors to occur. And then why we're here today, which is if we don't have boundaries, then you might have compassion fatigue or just fatigue and exhaustion, which can lead to burnout, which is what we're trying to prevent. Another lovely quote here by Olga Kazan, quote, "Boundaries are often thought of as rules for other people, but in reality, they are rules for ourselves. They're our own definition of what we're comfortable with and our own choice about what we'll do if someone ignores the boundary." So really it's about the self. And then we can talk about a little bit about the fact that there are personal relationships and there are professional relationships. And then there's the gray area in between, which is the intersection of personal and professional. Again, if I use the example of, let's say you're working in an environment in which you are the supervisor of a person that you are friends with, or that you were friends first, and then the relationship changed at work. What does that mean? And so that's a gray area. And what that might impact is how much you're sharing about yourself. If I keep going with this friend example, your friend might already know something about you before roles change. And so then what does that mean? Or they might be able to talk to you in a different way. Is that something that you want to be happening at work or not, right? So conversations have to happen in order to clarify what's expected when the gray area is engaged, right? There might be gray areas around, again, comfort with physical contact. What about receiving or offering presents to people? Again, this idea of dual or overlapping relationships. I said this before, living in the same community as your clients or your colleagues, going above and beyond for a client or a colleague. What I would say here is one of the things that I find really helpful in terms of deciding what I'm going to do or not do. The question becomes, especially in a professional environment, if I'm going to offer something to a client or a colleague, am I going to be able to offer that something to all clients and all colleagues? And if I can't, then am I setting a precedent that I can't then fulfill? Right? So that's an example of this question of, am I going above and beyond for someone? If I am, can I do that for everybody? And if I can't, then I'm setting myself up for something there. Over-identifying with client issues or situations. That's another sort of boundary to notice. Am I having a reaction to something and it's an unexpected reaction, or am I over-identifying with a problem? That's something to consider. And then rules around things like social media, especially nowadays. How do you work in the gray area? You want to, again, look at your guidelines, organizational policies, ethical guidelines, if you have them in your role. Self-awareness, which we'll talk about more in a second. Clear and transparent communication. So boundary setting is about communicating. And then supervision and self-care.